Imagine standing on the deck of the largest battleship ever built. It is late 1941, and you are surrounded by the cold, spraying mist of the North Pacific. Beneath your feet is 70,000 tons of Japanese steel, a floating fortress designed to crush anything in its path. To the sailors on board, looking out at the grey horizon, this ship isn't just a weapon. It is a promise. It is proof that their nation, an island empire smaller than California, has mastered the modern world. They believe they are invincible. They believe their spirit is stronger than steel. But thousands of miles away, inside the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, the mood is different. There is confidence, yes. There is pride. But there is also a creeping, cold dread that very few of them are willing to speak aloud, because the men looking at the maps, the men counting the barrels of oil and the tons of scrap metal, they know a secret. They know they are about to wake up a monster. This is the story of a gamble so massive, so reckless, that it defies logic. It is the story of how a group of highly intelligent, disciplined military leaders looked at the numbers, saw that they couldn't possibly win a long war, and then decided to start one anyway. And more importantly, it is the story of that terrifying moment when the adrenaline faded, the smoke cleared, and the Japanese high command realized that everything they had feared was coming true. They realized that the sleeping giant wasn't just awake. It was angry, and it was coming for them. To understand the panic that eventually gripped Tokyo, we have to understand the arrogance that came first. You have to go back to the months before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The atmosphere in Japan wasn't just aggressive, it was desperate. The nation was bogged down in a brutal, endless war in China. They were burning through resources faster than they could seize them. And then the United States turned off the tap. When America imposed the oil embargo, it was like a noose tightening around the neck of the Japanese empire. Their navy, their air force, their industries. Everything ran on American oil. The clock started ticking. Every day they waited, they grew weaker. Every day they waited, the American fleet grew stronger. So, the leaders in Tokyo felt they had a choice: slowly suffocate and accept becoming a second. Rate power, or strike now. Strike hard and seize the resources of Southeast Asia. But here is where the tragedy begins. It wasn't that they didn't know America was powerful. They knew. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who would plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, had lived in the United States. He studied at Harvard. He had hitchhiked across the country. He saw the steel mills in Pittsburgh. He saw the oil fields in Texas. He saw the Detroit car factories churning out automobiles faster than Japan could make bicycles. He knew what America was. When the Prime Minister asked him if Japan could win a war against the US, Yamamoto didn't lie. He said, "In the first 6 to 12 months of a war, with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." Think about that. The man in charge of the Navy is telling his government, "I can give you 1 year. After that, we are doomed." But the government didn't hear the warning. They only heard the promise of the first year. They convinced themselves that America was soft. They looked at the political division in Washington, the isolationism, the protests against the war in Europe, and they saw weakness. They believed that Americans were too comfortable, too obsessed with luxury and money to fight a long, bloody war. The Japanese High Command believed in the concept of spiritual power. They thought that because their soldiers were willing to die for the emperor, they could overcome any material disadvantage. They thought battles were decided by will, not by logistics. They were about to learn the hardest lesson in military history: spirit can't stop a shell that weighs as much as a car. Spirit can't shoot down 1,000 airplanes darkening the sky. So, the order was given. Climb Mount Nitoka. The fleet sailed, and on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, the gamble began. From a tactical perspective, Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece. It was bold, precise, and devastating. In a few hours, the Japanese Navy crippled the American Pacific Fleet. Battleships were burning in the mud. The pride of the US Navy was shattered. In Tokyo, the news was greeted with euphoria. Cheers erupted in the streets. Sake flowed. The generals and admirals slapped each other on the back. It seemed like the Americans were exactly what they thought: unprepared, careless, and weak. For the next few months, it felt like Yamamoto's prediction of "on running wild" was an understatement. The Japanese war machine was unstoppable. They swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. They captured fortress after fortress. British armies surrendered. American garrisons were overrun. The Japanese empire expanded across the Pacific at a speed that shocked the world. It was called victory disease. The leadership in Tokyo became drunk on their own success. They started to believe their own propaganda. They started to think the war was already won. But while the champagne corks were popping in Tokyo, a different sound was beginning to rise in the United States. It wasn't the sound of weeping or surrender. It was the sound of a factory whistle. The Japanese High Command had made their first fatal calculation. They thought Pearl Harbor would demoralize the Americans. They thought it would make them negotiate. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It filled the American public with a cold, unified rage. The isolationism evaporated overnight. The division was gone, and the most powerful industrial engine the world had ever seen began to shift gears from peace to war. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but deeply telling, about a Japanese officer in the early days of the war. He is looking at a captured American jeep. He examines it, expecting it to be complex and handmade like Japanese equipment. Instead, he sees that it is rough, simple, and clearly mass-produced. But then he looks closer. He finds a small metal plate on the engine block. It doesn't just have a serial number. It has instructions for how to fix it in the field, and then he finds a stash of spare parts under the seat. He realizes the terrifying truth. The Americans don't just build machines, they build systems. They assume things will break, and they are ready to fix them instantly. Japan built beautiful, elegant weapons like the Zero fighter and the Yamato battleship. But they were handcrafted. If they broke, you needed a master mechanic. If an American machine broke, you just swapped a part and kept moving. This was the invisible war, the war of logistics and production, and Japan was losing it before the first shot was even fired. Let's look at the numbers that the Japanese High Command tried to ignore. In 1941, the United States produced more steel in a single month than Japan produced in a year. The US had more oil in a single state than Japan had in its entire empire. But the Japanese bet everything on the idea that this capacity wouldn't matter because the war would be short. They were betting on a sprint. They didn't realize they had signed up for a marathon against a runner who never got tired. 6 months. That was the timeline Yamamoto gave, and almost exactly to the day, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the bill came due. The Battle of Midway. This is usually told as a story of brave pilots and lucky breaks, and it was. But from the perspective of the Japanese High Command, it was the moment the nightmare began. They sent 4 of their best aircraft carriers to finish off the American fleet. They expected to crush the remnants of the US Navy. Instead, in the span of 5 minutes, 5 minutes that changed the course of history, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into infernos. A 4th was destroyed later that day. The cream of the Japanese Navy, the trained pilots, the veteran crews, the invincible ships, gone. When the news reached Tokyo, it was so shocking that it was suppressed. The government lied to the public. They announced a great victory. They played patriotic music on the radio. But behind closed doors, the silence was deafening. The emperor was not told the full extent of the disaster. Army planners were kept in the dark by the Navy. The trust between the branches of the military began to fracture. This is the moment where the doubt started to rot the foundation of their confidence. The admirals looked at the reports. They realized they had lost more carriers in one day than they could build in 2 years. And then they looked at the intelligence reports coming from America. The Americans weren't just rebuilding, they were multiplying. New shipyards were popping up in places the Japanese had never heard of. Women were entering the workforce by the millions to build planes. The US government was spending money at a rate that made the Japanese budget look like pocket change. But the Japanese leadership was trapped. They couldn't stop. They couldn't say, "We made a mistake. Let's go back." The culture of the military, the intense pressure of saving face, meant they had to double down. They had to pretend they could still win. So, they moved into a new phase. If they couldn't win a quick knockout, they would make the war so bloody, so expensive, and so horrific that the Americans would get tired and quit. They would turn every island into a fortress. They would make the Americans pay for every inch of sand with gallons of blood. They believed that the American soldier was soft, that he couldn't handle the jungle, the heat, and the terror of close quarters combat. They looked at the map and pointed to a remote, fever-ridden island in the Solomon's chain, Guadalcanal. They decided this is where they would stop the American counter-attack. They poured men and ships into the fight. They sent wave after wave of soldiers into the jungle. And this is where the second great shock hit the Japanese High Command. They discovered that the American soldier was not soft. They found that the Marines on Guadalcanal fought with a savagery that matched their own. They found that the Americans could adapt. When the Japanese charged with bayonets, the Americans answered with semi-automatic rifles and canisters of grapeshot. When the Japanese used the jungle to hide, the Americans bulldozed the jungle and built airfields. During the battles for Guadalcanal, a strange thing started happening in the reports reaching Tokyo. Commanders on the ground started complaining about material superiority. They wrote that for every shell the Japanese fired, the Americans fired 10. For every soldier Japan landed, the Americans landed supplies, food, medicine, and ammunition. Starvation became a weapon. The Japanese Navy, once the rulers of the Pacific, couldn't get rice to their own troops because American planes and submarines were hunting them down. The Tokyo Express, fast destroyers used to drop off supplies at night, became a desperate run through a gauntlet of death. Back in the plush offices in Tokyo, the maps on the wall began to change. The red line of the Japanese Empire, which had expanded so far, stopped moving. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, it began to creep backward. But even then, in 1943, they didn't fully grasp the scale of what was coming. They thought they were fighting a war of attrition. They thought they were trading pawn for pawn. They didn't realize that, while they were losing their queens and rooks, the Americans were putting entirely new chessboards on the table. Tame. There is a chilling report from a Japanese diplomat in Europe around this time. He sent a message back to Tokyo describing the American arrival in the war against Germany. He talked about the skies over Europe being filled with American bombers. He talked about the endless convoys of trucks. He warned Tokyo that the industrial capacity of the United States was not just a military asset, it was a force of nature. It was like fighting an earthquake or a typhoon. The High Command read these reports. They filed them away. They couldn't act on them because to act on them would mean admitting the war was lost. So they retreated into a fantasy. They began to talk about decisive battles. They convinced themselves that if they could just lure the American fleet into one great trap, one massive showdown, they could destroy it and turn the tide. They became obsessed with this idea of the decisive battle. It was their only hope. They didn't understand that for the Americans, there was no such thing as a single decisive battle anymore. If the Americans lost a fleet, they would just build another one. If they lost an army, they would draft another one. The Japanese were fighting a 19th century war of strategy and courage. The Americans were fighting a 20th century war of production and annihilation. As part one of this story comes to a close, we stand on the precipice of the abyss. The initial victories are gone. The victory disease has been cured by the cold reality of defeat at Midway and Guadalcanal. The Japanese High Command is no longer celebrating. The rooms in Tokyo are quieter now. The sake has stopped flowing. They know the enemy is coming. They know the giant is awake. But they still have one card left to play. They believe that if they make the cost of victory high enough, the Americans will blink. They are about to unleash a new kind of horror on the Pacific. They are about to ask their young men to do the unthinkable. And they are about to see something that no one in the history of warfare had ever seen before. The horizon of the ocean completely filled from north to south with the steel of the United States Navy. The sleeping giant wasn't just walking anymore. It was beginning to run. By 1943, the war had shifted from a contest of strategy to a contest of pure physics. In the halls of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, the maps were no longer sources of pride. They were sources of anxiety, the red line, that marked the empire's perimeter was being pushed back, inch by bloody inch. But what truly terrified the men in those rooms wasn't just the battles they were losing. It was how they were losing them. They had expected a warrior's fight. They expected a clash of swords where the braver, more disciplined man would win. Instead, they found themselves fighting a mathematical impossibility. There is a moment that perfectly captures the despair taking hold of the Japanese military, a moment that sounds like a joke but was actually a death sentence. It involves something as simple as ice cream. Sometime in the middle of the war, Japanese intelligence officers intercepted a strange report from the Pacific. They learned that the United States Navy had commissioned a special ship. It wasn't a battleship. It wasn't a carrier. It was a concrete barge towed behind the fleet, dedicated entirely to manufacturing ice cream for American sailors. It could produce 500 gallons every single shift. When this report reached the desk of a high-ranking Japanese officer, he reportedly put his head in his hands. His own troops were starving on islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea. They were eating roots, lizards, and sometimes even the leather straps of their equipment just to survive. And here was the enemy, the Americans, with so much excess fuel, so much excess engineering capacity, and so much shipping space that they could tow a floating ice cream factory across the ocean just to keep morale up. That was the moment the intellectual realization truly hit. Japan wasn't fighting an army, they were fighting a supply chain that had no bottom. The Japanese soldier was told to endure hunger to show his spirit. The American soldier was given steak and ice cream to keep him fighting. It was a collision between a medieval mindset and an industrial superstate. This realization began to bleed into every aspect of the war. The high command in Tokyo started receiving reports that didn't make sense to them. They had spent years training their navy to fight at night. The Japanese optics, their binoculars and sighting scopes, were the best in the world. Their plan was always to engage the Americans in the dark, where their superior training would cut through the American numbers. But suddenly, the dark wasn't safe anymore. American ships started firing with terrifying accuracy in the pitch black, hitting Japanese vessels before the Japanese lookouts could even see them. It was radar. The Americans had it on almost every ship. The Japanese had almost none. A surviving Japanese destroyer captain later described the feeling of fighting the Americans in 1943 and 1944. He said it felt like fighting a blind swordsman who suddenly opened his eyes. The element of surprise, the one thing Japan relied on to even the odds, was gone. The Americans could see through clouds, through smoke, and through the night. In Tokyo, the technical officers scrambled to catch up, but they lacked the rare metals and the electronic components. They were trying to build radios with vacuum tubes that were obsolete 10 years ago, while the Americans were deploying technology that looked like magic. And then there was the silence from the sky. At the start of the war, the Japanese Zero was the king of the air. It was fast, agile, and had incredible range. The pilots who flew them were the samurai of the sky, trained for years, elite and irreplaceable. But the Japanese High Command had made another fatal error. They didn't have a plan to replace those men. They kept their best pilots on the front lines until they died. The Americans did something different. When an American pilot became an ace, they pulled him out of the cockpit and sent him home to train the new guys. They took that hard-earned experience and multiplied it. The Japanese let their experience die in the cockpit. By 1944, the reports coming back to Tokyo were horrific. The new American planes, the Hellcats and Corsairs, were faster and tougher than the Zero. They had armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. If you shot a Zero, it exploded. If you shot a Hellcat, it absorbed the bullets and flew home. This disparity culminated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a disaster so complete it shook the foundations of the Japanese government. The Japanese Navy had gathered its strength for that decisive battle they had been dreaming of. They launched hundreds of aircraft to attack the American fleet. They expected a great victory to turn the tide. Instead, the American radar picked them up miles away. The American fighters were waiting. It was a slaughter. The Americans shot down over 300 Japanese planes in a single afternoon. The loss was so lopsided that the American pilots gave it a grim nickname: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the command bunker in Tokyo, the admiral stared at the wall. The carriers were empty. The planes were gone. The pilots, the last hope of the empire, were dead in the water. But the most terrifying part was the report on the American losses. They had lost barely 30 planes. It was a kill ratio of 10-1. This is where the psychological break began for the Japanese high command. You have to understand the culture they were operating in. They couldn't just say, "We lost." Admitting defeat was a betrayal of the emperor. It was a betrayal of the thousands who had already died. So, they began to lie to themselves on a massive scale. They started looking for miracles. They started talking about divine wind. They stopped relying on strategy and started relying on suicide. But the Americans didn't stop. They were like a glacier, slow, crushing, and impossible to halt. They bypassed the strongholds. If Japan fortified an island with 10,000 men, the Americans would just skip it. They would cut off the supply lines and let the Japanese soldiers starve, while the American fleet moved on to the next target. This silent hopping strategy was a nightmare for Tokyo. They couldn't predict where the blow would come. They had to defend everything, which meant they could defend nothing. And then the war came to the one place Japan could not afford to lose: the Marianas. The Marianas Islands. Specifically, the island of Saipan. Saipan was critical. The Japanese High Command knew it. They called it the Absolute National Defense Zone. If Saipan fell, the Americans would be within bomber range of Tokyo itself. The new American bomber, the B-29 Superfortress, could take off from Saipan, fly to Tokyo, drop its payload, and fly back. The Japanese army promised the emperor that Saipan was impregnable. They said it would never fall. They dug tunnels, they built bunkers, they positioned their best troops. But the Americans didn't care about pregnable. They unleashed a bombardment that shattered the island. They landed tens of thousands of Marines. The fighting was brutal, apocalyptic. But the result was never in doubt. The Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Civilians, terrified by propaganda that told them the Americans were monsters, threw themselves off cliffs rather than surrender. It was a tragedy of epic proportions. When the news that Saipan had fallen reached Tokyo, the illusion finally shattered. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a political earthquake. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the face of the war, the man who had led Japan since before Pearl Harbor, was forced to resign. The government fell. The mood in the capital shifted from grim determination to quiet terror. The senior statesmen, the men who whispered in the shadows behind the throne, began to meet secretly. They knew. They finally, truly understood. The absolute defense zone was breached. The gate to the home islands was wide open. There is a story of a meeting around this time between a senior Navy admiral and an Army general. The Army general was demanding more ships to transport troops to reinforce the next island. The admiral looked at him, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He simply slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a list of ships sunk by American submarines in the last month. The Japanese merchant marine was being strangled. American submarines were sinking tankers and cargo ships faster than Japan could count them, let alone replace them. The factories in Osaka were running out of steel. The planes in Nagoya were waiting for aluminum that was at the bottom of the ocean. The civilians in Tokyo were seeing their rice rations cut again and again. The admiral reportedly said, "The war is not being lost on the beaches. It is being lost in the shipping lanes." But the army general refused to listen. He banged the table. He talked about spirit. He talked about the samurai code. This was the tragedy of the Japanese High Command in late 1944. They were split between the men who looked at the spreadsheets and saw the end, and the men who looked at the code of Bushido and saw only glory in death. The rational men knew the war was over. The irrational men controlled the guns. And so, the decision was made, to surrender, but to escalate. If they couldn't match the American machines, they would turn their men into machines. The High Command began to draft the plans for the Special Attack Units. The kamikazes. It was a decision born of pure desperation. They looked at the American fleet. Hundreds of ships, carriers, battleships, destroyers, stretching to the horizon, and they realized that conventional attacks were useless. A Japanese pilot in a Zero had almost zero chance of surviving the wall of American anti-aircraft fire to drop a bomb. But if the pilot was the bomb, if he didn't plan to come back, maybe, just maybe, he could get through. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. A winning nation doesn't ask its brightest young men to kill themselves. A winning nation doesn't turn its planes into guided missiles. It was the strategy of a cornered animal. As 1944 turned into 1945, the Japanese High Command sat in their bunkers and waited for the inevitable. They knew the B-29s were coming. They knew the sky over Tokyo would soon be dark with American aluminum. They had unleashed a giant, and now the giant was standing on their doorstep holding a torch. The conversations in Tokyo changed. They stopped asking, "How do we win?" and started asking, "How do we die beautifully?" They began to prepare the civilian population for the decisive battle on the homeland. They taught women to fight with bamboo spears. They told school children that they would be the last line of defense. They had seen the American power. They had seen the ice cream barges, the radar-guided guns, the armadas that covered the ocean, and the endless waves of bombers. They understood, finally, that they had been wrong about everything. Diving, the Americans were not soft. They were a terrifying industrial grinder that chewed up empires and spit out dust. But the pride of the High Command was a heavy chain. They couldn't unlock it. And because they couldn't unlock it, millions more would have to die. The worst was not over. The fire was just beginning.